So in the last section, we talked about interrogations, and specifically, we went into depth with the Reid technique. Um, Today's lecture or this section will tackle some of the problems found with the Reid technique and further discuss other interrogation techniques. So if you remember, we went over history of interrogation, witchcraft, and other sorcery came up. Then the Reid technique, which had 3 stages and 9 steps. Today, more broadly, or in the confession lectures, we'll go over erroneous outcomes, false confessions, how often do they happen, if they happen, the types, science of characteristics that might make you more likely to false confess, and then alternative interrogation methods. So there are when interrogating a suspect, there are 2 types of outcomes that people should be concerned with. The first is a false denial. So this is when a guilty suspect proclaims that they are innocent, and this is the most common, so this happens more often than the other erroneous outcome. And this potentially leads to dangerous offenders escaping punishment. So there is a detrimental outcome to this. So we do want to avoid false denials. We want people who are guilty to confess. And then there's another problem in which one would call a false confession, and this is when an innocent suspect proclaims that they are guilty. So they confess to a crime that they did not actually commit. This is the most commonly researched, so there is a gap between what happens most often and then what gets the most attention by science. We tend to study more on false confessions just because the consequence of this is high. So this potentially leads to innocent persons being punished. This is, as I'm sure most people would agree with, this is a problem because prison isn't fun, and people who are innocent shouldn't be punished for something they didn't do. But there are many perceptions and misperceptions about confessions. Just going to this erroneous outcome of a false confession, which I will let you guess as to which of them are true or false. So the first common perception that people have is that trained interviewers can detect truth and deception. Based on what we've likely already talked about, is this true or not? A second perception is that Miranda warnings protect the accused. So if you've ever watched Cops, you know what a Miranda warning is. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Do you understand these rights? So these rights are thought to protect people. Another perception that people have about confessions is that people do not confess to crimes that they do not commit. I think you've already figured out that that's not true. There are cases of false confessions. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about false confessions so much in science. And then another perception is that people are good at recognizing false confessions. So judges believe that jurors can recognize a false confession. They believe that they can recognize a false confession. Whether or not that's true, we'll get into. And then another perception is that confession errors are harmless. So if a confession that is deemed inadmissible in trial is brought up, it's thought that jurors can understand that they can't use that in their decision-making process, and that they are still fair in how they make decisions. Also, giving another type of confession error is telling suspects information about the case that only the perpetrator would know, and it's thought that this is harmless, but really this is problematic because if someone knows the details of the crime and then confesses, it's harder to determine if that's false or not. But really, all of these are false. And we'll get into that as we move forward in this lecture. So facts do matters. facts do matter. Interrogators can't detect truth and deception better than chance. So really, there's a problem in that. We can't determine who's falsely or truly confessing. And then innocent people are more likely to waive their Miranda rights. This is problematic because then if you waive your rights, they can't protect you. And interestingly, 81% of innocent people waive their Miranda rights. So they're putting themselves at risk of false confession or otherwise being prosecuted because of waiving these rights. And 36% of guilty people waive their Miranda rights. So fewer people who are guilty waive those rights, but that's not to say that we should look at that as an indicator of guilt or not. A lot of times people who are factually guilty have some understanding that they need those rights and that maybe they should invoke their Fifth Amendment right to silence. People do confess to crimes they did not commit, which we'll get into even further. And the idea that jurors can detect false confession is just wrong. Jurors, juries, and judges, they are able to detect coercion and deception from law enforcement on suspects, but they still convict at just as high of a rate. So even though they recognize that the confession was possibly brought upon because of coercion, it doesn't really deter them from not using that information against the defendant. Additionally, jurors still convict at higher rates when they report the interrogation was highly coercive and claim it did not weigh on their decision. Well, we know based on some studies by Casson and Sugel that that's not true, that they say that they didn't use the information, but they convicted just as much as the people who didn't hear that it was inadmissible. But false confessions are extremely rare, right? Like they hardly ever happen. That's the perception. A lot of people say that only those suffering from some sort of psychological distress or some sort of mental handicap would falsely confess, that no one in their right mind would confess to a crime that they didn't commit. And many people say that maybe others are somewhat likely to confess, but I'm not. So the perception is like, I would never confess to a crime that I didn't commit. The true rate of false confessions, however, is unknown. We do have some information to kind of like give us an idea of how often false confessions occur. 28% of Innocence Project exonerees falsely confessed, and 36 of the 344 who pled guilty. So that's an admission of guilt in itself. So other than just having a confession, pleading guilty is also considered a false confession. And this is problematic because this is potentially more than a quarter of people who are serving time for crimes they didn't commit did falsely confess. So the rate probably isn't all that small. And here is some data from a national database looking at exonerees that have thousands of people that have been exonerated for various crimes. As you see, the rate of false confession is orange, and looking at this graph, it does vary based on what someone is being accused of. So the lowest rate is for other crimes and child sexual abuse. Homicide has a higher rate. Part of this might be because interrogators are putting more pressure when it's homicide, and it's potentially not as damning to say that you abused a child. So the false confession rates here vary, but we have some understanding that it's at least more reliable than Bigfoot. People falsely confess. We know We know it occurs. We know it's more than every once in a very blue moon in terms of people who have been convicted for crimes they haven't committed. One reason that it's hard to know the true rate of false confessions is that it's difficult to determine a false confession. Investigators interrogate because they believe a suspect is guilty, so a confession is only telling them what they already knew, or knew in quotation marks, but sometimes a confession can be determined as false if the crime never happened. Sometimes people confess to things that they murdered someone, but the person's actually not dead, or that it's physically impossible, that they were in jail or out of state at the time, so they just were otherwise not there, and there's no way they could have committed the crime. Or the actual perpetrator is identified objectively through DNA evidence. So, science. So it's hard to determine what the rate is of false confessions, but it's not as rare as the public perceives it to be. And as we'll get into, there are many things that would make you more susceptible to a false confession, whether that be an individual characteristic or that of the interrogation itself. So there are three main types of false confessions: voluntary, coerced, compliant, and coerced internalized, which I'll let the expert on this give that information. This is Saul Kassin, who is one of the leading researchers on false confessions, if not the leading researcher.
I want to talk about why innocent people confess to crimes they did not commit. I can't think of a psychologically more profound question. If I were to ask the average person, would you ever confess to a crime you did not commit? Everybody would say no. Why would an innocent person confess? Really, there are a couple of different reasons. First of all, sometimes the question is answerable really by looking at who it is we're talking about. There are people who are weak and vulnerable to manipulation. Put them in an interrogation, they have very little tolerance for stress. They don't fully understand the consequences of giving a confession. So children, adolescents, people with mental health issues, people with low IQs, people who are in a state of shock at the time that they're being interrogated. These people are likely to give a confession because, you know what? Everybody has a breaking point, and they found theirs. And so they give a confession not fully appreciating what's going to happen next. A second issue in these cases has to do with the story about interrogation. Anyone who has not been through an American-style police interrogation can't fully appreciate the stress they would be under. Isolated, alone, away from anything and everyone that is familiar, put under stress and accused of a crime, and every time you deny your involvement, you're called a liar. Police will be confronting you with evidence. They may even be lying to you about the evidence and confusing you in the process. And in all of that, in the back of the innocent person's mind is, I want to get out of this situation. And you know what? I didn't do anything wrong. So I'll give them their statement. And when we're done, they'll investigate the case and they'll see that I had nothing to do with this. What the innocent person doesn't realize, in the naive belief that their innocence will shine through, what the innocent person doesn't realize is their confession more often than not closes the case. Part of the problem for judges and juries is that false confessions sound real. And for that reason, some of the research that we have done, my colleagues and I and others, shows that people cannot distinguish a true confession from a false confession. And that's a problem. And then you add to that the fact that confessions have a powerful effect on juries. When juries hear confessions, they will trust that confession almost more than they will trust anything else.
So Saul Kassin gave you an overview of what these are and kind of went into some depth. But to really hone down on this on these concepts, I want to go into them in more detail. So a voluntary confession happens when a person voluntarily confesses to a crime and not due to coercion from police or anybody else. So voluntary confession may be motivated by different things. So it might be fame. So people are confessing to this crime because they think that'll make them infamous. And then other things might be like protecting others, parents who might confess to a crime to cover up their child's wrongdoing. And then there are other reasons, of course, for protecting others. Maybe they're your friends or other reasons. And then there's psychological reasons. Maybe someone is psychologically unsound or has struggling with some sort of issues that cause them to just voluntarily confess, although they know that they didn't commit the crime. One example, this is Matthew Gonzalez, who voluntarily confessed to a murder of a young girl and his late wife while writing letters to his sister from jail. So I had worked on his case when I was at the public defender's office, and during his time in jail, which we thought he might have suffered from schizophrenia, he wrote this letter confessing to killing a 12-year-old girl named Kaylee Wilson that had at the time gone missing and was found dead. And this was like a high-profile case in the area, and Gonzalez ended up confessing in a letter to his sister, but police were able to determine that he didn't actually kill her because he was incarcerated at that time. One example for fame is the Black Dahlia confessor. So in January of 1947, the body of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short was found in a vacant lot in Los Angeles, and was carefully posed and severed in half at the waist. So this was a very violent crime, and got overwhelming public attention. But there are estimates of how many people confess this crime, but it's anywhere from dozens to hundreds of people came forward to falsely confess to her killing, including transient Daniel Voorhees, who his photo is above. Some couldn't even identify Short in a lineup of photographs, the woman that was killed, and the murder went unsolved. So people confess for a variety of different reasons, fame, protecting others, or psychological distress. And then we have coerced compliant confessions, and this is coerced compliant interrogations result from the belief that short-term benefits of a confession outweigh the long-term costs. So remember, this is the main idea underlying the Reid technique of interrogation. People may be motivated to escape the interrogation or gain the reward of leniency. One example of this is the Central Park jogger case. The boys thought if they admitted to one small thing, they could go home, so they complied to the interrogators. I believe I have a video I can show you. Yes, here we go. So this is the Central Park jogger case for those of you who might not be familiar with it. This happened in New York in the 90s.
I want us to remember what happened that day and be horrified by ourselves. New York in the late 1980s was a completely schizophrenic, divided city.
New York's now the capital of racial violence. If I had more bullets, I would have shot them all again and again.
Criminality, gang wars, drug wars. Who was supposed to be afraid? It would have been irrational not to be afraid.
Off with the camera, man!
Last night, a woman jogger was found unconscious and partially clothed in Central Park. She was beaten and sexually assaulted.
A woman jogging in Central Park. Central Park was holy. It was the crime of the century.
5 youths were arrested at 96th Street, all between 14 and 15 years of age.
They got him!
You can only imagine the pressure to have this crime solved and solved quickly.
First we was all together, then they started to put us in different rooms separately.
What did you do? Who were you with? Who did you come with?
The tone was very scary. I felt like they might take us to the back of the precinct and kill us.
Never go home until you give up a story.
I told my son, go to the park that night. I feel guilty.
I'm telling the guy, I don't know what you're talking about. They're getting a little angry. And they're like, you know you did it, didn't you?
He has been interrogated for over 24 hours. That amounts to pressure.
These young men were guilty. It was almost unquestioned. The police controlled the story. They created the story.
They seized on the fears of the people, wilding the bestial characterization of the black man.
There's no DNA match whatsoever to any of these boys.
I was going nuts. No blood on the kids. Nobody could identify them, but if they confessed, and that was that.
A lot of people didn't do their jobs. Reporters, police, prosecutors, defense lawyers. This was institutional protection.
We falsely convicted them, and we walked away from our crime.
This is the ultimate siren that says none of us is safe.
So the Central Park jogger case, essentially, if you look into it, the boys thought if they admitted to one small thing, they could go home, so they complied with the interrogators. They said, yeah, I saw it happen, or they admitted to some small portion of it, but thinking that they would go home, but they didn't, and they were exonerated by DNA evidence. So some innocent people will confess to end the interrogation because they think the police have real evidence and will soon find the DNA or fingerprints do not match. So that was something that was said from some of the Central Park jogger suspects, was just that, well, if I say I did it, then I'll be out of this room and they'll go look at the real evidence because they said they have this DNA or they have this, and then I'll get to go home. But that oftentimes isn't the case. Confession is some of the most damning evidence that you can bring to trial. And sometimes they don't even test the DNA after the fact because you confess. So of course you're guilty. So this is coerced compliant. They know they didn't do it, but this belief that the short-term benefits of confession outweigh the long-term costs. So I'm just going to confess so I can get out of here. Nope.
I want us to...
And then we have internalized confessions. Of course, internalized confessions occur when the suspect distrusts their own memory and then internalizes that guilt. So one example or one way this happens is distrust of one's own memory. So this might be related to suggestive and manipulative interrogation techniques, such as, like you heard in the Central Park jogger case, is that there are 24 hours or more of interrogation. So the interrogation's long, and if you remember in the Reid technique, the officer is probably not allowing you to deny guilt, and then they're lying about the evidence. So if someone tells you that they have your fingerprints at the scene or your DNA was at the scene, you might then to question your own memory. Well, maybe I did do it. And you might be related to the person who was the victim, and so you might see it more plausible that you committed this crime, and that maybe you blacked out or some other reason, but you start internalizing it because of the interrogation, essentially, and other individual characteristics as well. But one example is Marty Tankleff, who was convicted of killing both of his parents at 17. The police told him that his dad awakened from a coma and said that Marty shot them. So when the parents were found, Marty was alive in the house. Someone had came in and shot both of his parents. His father left alive but was in critical condition. And so the police said he woke up from a coma and said, Marty shot, your dad said that you shot him. And this caused Marty to question his own memory. He said, well, if my dad says I did it, then I did it. My dad wouldn't lie. He soon recanted his confession, though, when he was sitting in jail and found out his father had not actually awakened from coma and was dead. He was subjected to a lengthy and often brutal psychological interrogation. And just knowing that your parents were shot, this is a terrible scenario to be in, and then be interrogated during this time when your father is in the hospital. So Marty Tangleff confessed and spent many years in prison and was exonerated.